computer. All right. We have gotten down in Unit 3, and we was talking about some of the things that Alexander Campbell had contributed to that time. And one of the four of the things that we mentioned that's very important to us in reference to the social life, and not on that, but for the spiritual life. Because Alexander
Bobby,
Campbell, yeah.
What page is that?
Oh, my,
Sorry.
69. 69D.
69?
Yeah,
Okay.
D.
Okay.
Thank
you, sir.
Okay. So Alexander encouraged the merging of society, both socially and commercially. And so that helped everything in that area. And also he encouraged intermarriage with the Persians, and that didn't help them any. But because if you want to stop for a moment and think about it, they are Gentile people, and so they would be married, but they were married to other people of another area. He diffused Grecian culture and religion and philosophy among the conquered people. He was, last of all, what the thing that helps us is that he so diffused the Greek language among the nations that it became a high universal language. And that's started out. That's one I didn't change last week. And so this contribution greatly facilitated the spread of Christianity some 3 centuries later. So when we stop and we think about that, and I think I mentioned this, that we have to stop and think about how that God has this plan, how God, through that of our history, that you can see the providence of God. You can see his plan working. And here's one part of that working. They had to have a universal language, able to preach the gospel to that of the Jews and Gentiles. If not, it's like with us today. It's hard for us to lead the United States of America because we all speak English. And say, for instance, go down to Mexico, begin to preach the gospel. Now, the cities that are closer to that of the United States and Mexico, most likely they teach English. But back down, way on down, that might not be the case. Did they teach English over in Panama?
Yes, they do.
Okay, so that wouldn't be as hard. Yet you'd still have, because we in the South have a different vocabulary and meanings of words, so we would have to be very careful. I know when I went to Riga, Latvia, they told me, said, don't be telling any jokes because they won't understand your humor. So,
Yes.
So you have to be very careful in doing that, but have the same language. Now, like in Vietnam, we had something like, if I recall correctly, 23 different dialects. Now, they can make things out, and I've talked to Isabel. She's from Spain, and she can figure out some of the Hispanic, that is the Mexican Spanish. And but most likely her and Ilka, your Jim's wife, can actually carry a better conversation in that because she is from a different area. But also Alexander died at the early age of 33. His kingdom was divided among his generals. And so Alexander died, as I said, at the age of 33. In the historian's history of the world, there is an interesting account of his life. We mentioned this last week's pages 390 and 391. He reigned 12 2/3 years. And so he left no heir. So you can see that he died at an early age at 33, but he reigned, let's just say 13 years. So he started when he was 20 years old, really when he was 19, but close to 20. His reputed son, Hercules, that's what I always say his name is, has been slain for some time before that he dies. So the emperor was, the empire was held in trust by his generals for an unborn son by Roxana, and only one of his successors, Cassander, murdered Roxana and her son. And so the kingdom was divided into 4 parts among his generals, and namely, you had Antigonus occupy the country from Mediterranean to the Central Asia. Cassander ruled Macedonia. Ptolemy Legi ruled Egypt and southern Syria, and this Machias ruled Thrace. And so that brought us down to the point that where we are. I click and get it changed. Wrong one, Bobby. So what we do is we come down to Daniel's. The great horn was broken. And so this brings us back to the Old Testament because, again, since God has a plan, Ephesians 3, verses 9 through 12, when we're reading those passages, he has a plan. That plan has to be worked out among that of the Old Testament people, the Jews and the Gentiles, because the Gentiles are going to be part of the kingdom of God. And so what happens is that prophets, they prophesy things, and when they prophesy things, they prophesy about things that are going to come. And that's what Daniel does. So if you turn over to Daniel chapter 5, sitting here knowing that I'm going to go there, and I have mine at Daniel 11. We're going to go there too. But if you go to Daniel chapter 8, I said 5, 8, verse 5, and we'll begin reading there in just a few moments what happens. And we'll talk about what happens, okay? We just won't just read. We'll come back and look at each verse, nearly each verse. We can't cover each verse, but we want to make sure we understand it. So here's Daniel as he's writing. He says, and as I was considering, behold, and he goat, in other words, he's talking about the dreams and the prophecies that he's getting from that of God. He says, and as I was considering, behold, and he goat came from the west on the face of the whole earth and touched not the ground. And the goat had a notable horn between his eyes. That looks like a unicorn, probably
Yes.
some people would say. And so he came to the ram, and that had two horns, which I see standing before the river, and ran unto him in the fury of his power. And I saw him come close unto the ram, and he was moved with a choler against him, and smote the ram, and brake him into his two horns. And there was no power in the ram to stand before him, but he cast him down to the ground and stamped him, and there was none that could deliver the ram out of his hand. Therefore the he-goat waxed very great, and when he was strong, the great horn was broken, and for it came up four notable ones toward the four winds of heaven. Now, again, we understand that he's talking into that a figurative language, and so we have to try to understand the figurative language. Now, the New King James says, and as I was considering, behold, and he-goat came from the west in the face of the whole earth and touched not the ground, and the goat had a notable horn between his eyes. And so as I was considering suddenly, he says there, the vision continued. The prophet now saw a male goat approaching him from the west, and its feet scarcely touching the earth. And perhaps he came so swiftly that his feet appeared never to make contact with that of the surface of the earth, or appeared to do so. And so the third kingdom, symbolized by the male goat in this vision, was the Grecian Empire. It was also described as being swift in Daniel 7:6. And after this, I beheld, and lo, another like the leopard, which had upon the back of its four wings of a fowl, the beast that had also four heads, and dominion was given to it. So it's a significant feature that this goat was a horn between his eyes. And again, it's conspicuous. I mean, it was so noticeable or notable that it could not be overlooked, like the skull. He talks about the skull of the goat, like a bull sheep, is thick and hard, and this horn being, as it were, at the very center of the head, would obviously be formidable as a weapon. And we would think about that also. The commentator, Leopold, makes a distinction in his book. He says the distinctive mark of all was perhaps the fact that he goat had a prominent horn between his eyes. The expression there, he gives the Hebrew, might mean horn of vision, or as the other Hebrew word renders it. But he says the other Hebrew word can be a metonymy of also what we call a metonymy of means. Being a metonymy of means, conspicuous, that is, the conspicuousness, horn of conspicuousness. There's a lot of those usness there. That is to say, a prominent horn. What made this phenomenal, usually outstanding, was the fact that the horn grew out between the eyes, which is certainly not the usual position of a horn, and still no particular significance attached to this feature of the vision. It serves merely to make the horn unusual and distinctive. I guess what we would think about it, that it'd be something that we would remember. Oh, it had a horn between its two eyes. But did this goat also have horns that normally are behind the eyes and near the ears? Nothing is said about all those other horns. And so we perceive that he only had this one. We read verses 6 and 7 there. And when we go to the New King James of that, it says, then he came to the ram that had two horns, which I had seen standing before the river, and ran to him with fierce power. And I saw him confronting the ram. He was moved with rage against him, and he attacked the ram and broke his two horns. There was no power, he says, that one could deliver from the ram. And so here, Daniel, and also you have the American Standard there. Here, Daniel describes his prophetic language, the conflict between the emperor of Persia and now the rising emperor of that of Greece. And so we actually miss some things by not bringing up chapter 2, because you go back to chapter 2, he talks about what he saw. He says, O King sawest, thou, O King, sawest, behold, a great image, Daniel 2, verse 31. This great image, whose brightness was excellent, stood before thee, and the form thereof was terrible. This image head was a fine gold. Who is the fine gold? The fine gold is the Babylonian Empire. And his breast and his arms of silver. And those arms were, as we would say, notice his arms too, so Medo-Persian Empire. And then he says, has his arms of silver and his belly and like for thighs and so forth, and his legs of iron. That would be the Roman Empire. So we would find they're talking about, as they use in figurative language, he's talking about these different kingdoms that would come up. And that's what Daniel was talking about. Now remember, Daniel is still in Babylonian captivity. And so here we find that he's talking about this. And so Daniel describes the prophetic language, the conflict between the empire of Persia and the rising empire of that of Greece. Now, Persia had grown older and weaker. Greece had grown stronger and aggressive and had excellent warriors with new methods of fighting. It was similar to the mass armies of Peter the Great, eventually wearing down and defeating their former great rivals. And so Sweden, during the early years of the 18th century. Now, we understand this, so we try to learn from that of history. And so, you know, when we get weak, when we don't keep up with, I guess, what we call the arms races or that of new weaponry for our military, then we could grow weak. And so when Alexander came to power in Greece, though, he set out on a campaign of conquest. He invaded the territory of Persia, an empire that was ripe for harvest by the strong, aggressive nation. It was wealthy, weak, and had lost its great strength. And so in the graphic words of Daniel's vision, this young, strong he-goat, Greece, led by Alexander, crashed into the ram, Persia, dealing it a death blow. After this violent attack, the horns of the ram were broken. The ram fell to the ground and was trampled, and there was no one to give it aid. Again, Leopold, he talks about, he says the entire new feature entering into the description is the fact that the he-goat ran against it and in his rammed against it. Change that right quick. Rammed against it in his great anger. So the creature must have displayed a certain ferocity that reminded one of the attitude of anger on the part of human being. Now, the human Hebrew expression in the hot anger of his strength means in great anger. Sometimes we may ought to go over and look at some of the language that he talks about in reference to that of God, his hot anger, wrath, and so forth. And so we find that there's a significance, certain significance, in fact, which emphasized by repetition that the ram was standing in front of the river. This pictures the historical clash of the Greeks and the Persians at the Granchius, for it was a river that had two great foes and first met in this the Asian Wars. And so the great anger that marked the he-goat points out to a historical reality. For after several earlier assaults of the Persians upon the Greeks are very angry at the attempted subjugation. And so Alexander's Greeks went about their task of conquest as though it would just be done to avenge a great wrong. So in fact, this anger grew to the point where it was nothing less than rage. He was enraged against it, he says. So this fury at the same time represented the nature of certain or separate attacks that were made upon the Persians in the course of the war. There was an irresistible impetuosity about them and great panic in the hearts of the more timid foe. But the first results of the impact of the he goat's budding was that he broke its two horns. This cannot refer to the separate conquest of the Medians and Persians, but referring to the breaking up of the empire as a whole. Or such horns typified strength. And so the breaking of horns refers to the crushing of the Persian strength. So this is verified by the statement says there was not strength left in the realm to stand before it. So we understand what the figurative language says there. The Persian ruler Darius put down a rebellion, saved the empire, and recorded his victory over his enemies on the famous rock of Behistun, visible from the old cavern road and from Ecbatana to that Babylon, this pivotal monument with its trilingual inscriptions describing Darius's foiling of insurrection, furnished the key to decipherment of that of Akkad, the cuneiform, just as the Rosetta Stone opened the ancient language of the Nile River. So our archaeological findings have really helped us, and so we actually probably need to go back and look and see if they got any more update on some of those and some of the things they may have found. Darius ruled a vast empire. The closing years of his reign saw the outbreak of the Graeco-Persian Wars and the defeat of Persia at Marathon. Notice that now, Marathon. We have Marathon gas and oil today. A precursor to the late defeat of the Salamis in 480 BC. As some people call it, they call it Urgers. So the invasions of Greece by the Persians had aroused a bitter enmity between the two powers. But now Greece was in their ascendancy, and Persian had lost their former power. So it was only a matter of time before Alexander's army actually conquered their eastern adversary. So to make the idea of thorough conquest still move vivid in that the he-goat is represented as casting the ram down to the ground and trampling it. His conquest puts a new complexion on the whole war that is the world of Asia, and sets in motion ideas and principles that would predominate certain conquered areas for centuries to come. So if anything were needed to make their thought of most complete conquest still much more emphatic, there is the added thought that there was none that could deliver the realm from his power. So no matter what vast hordes were opposed by the young Macedonian Alexander in his conquest, although these numbers may have been exaggerated by some of the historians, but nothing could bolster the decayed strength of the decrepit Persian Empire. And so the following gives us a sketch of the initial battle. That is, after the assassination of his father, King Philip III in 336 BC, Alexander ascended to the throne of Macedonia. Like I said, now we're talking about someone 19 to 20 years old, maybe 19 and a half or whatever, 19 and 2/3 of the year. So that would be 8 months. He might be 19 years old and 8 months. So he also inherited the loyalty of the professional army with his father, which his father had created at the time when Macedonia had just come to dominating most of that of Greece. And so after destroying the rebellious forces at Thrace and Thebes, Alexander had succeeded in crushing the last opposition to his kingship. And so effectively becoming sole ruler of Greece. So Alexander now sets his sights on fulfilling his father's dream of conquering the vast and powerful Persian Empire to the east. Now, in 334, Alexander crossed the Hellespont into Persia, and he had 40,000 men. 40,000 men. And his first goal was to secure the Aegean coastline, thus denying the Persian naval fleet bases with which they could sail against Greece in his absence. So as the Macedonian Greek army continued to south, he came upon the Persian forces blocking their advance at the river of Granicus, jetting inland from the Aegean Sea, and the river was extremely shallow for that time of the year and would later prove not much of a barrier for either side to cross. And so the Persian forces were commanded not by one man, but led by a coalition of more than 40 high-ranking generals and princes and other Persian aristocrats with little or no battle experience. So the one exception being that of Memnon, commander of the Greek mercenary forces. And Memnon was a highly decorated, experienced battlefield general who had fought with distinction in the Greek war. So for the upcoming battle, Alexander Campbell had 40,000 men, 35,000 infantry, and 5,000 cavalry. Would face a Persian army numbering 33,000 men, 15,000 cavalry, and 10,000 infantry, and 8,000 Greek mercenaries. Now, again, we give all those numbers, and it could be more or less of those. So the Persians deployed all their cavalry in line stretching the entire length of the battlefield. So the Persian infantry and the Greek mercenaries were positioned in one line to the rear of the cavalry. So Alexander positioned his Greek phalanx, I think this is called phalanxes, I'm sorry, XES Z's, phalanxes, opposite the Persians' cavalry along the bank of the river, then splitting his cavalry forces into two groups, placing 3,000 horsemen, which included 1,000 strong, as we would think about strong elite companions. And on his right wing, he with the remaining 2,000 on his left. So Alexander's army was then divided into two independent forces. Right wing under Alexander's direct command, while the left would be entrusted to the Parmenian. So Alexander began the battle himself, personally leading 1,500 cavalry towards the Persian left flank. And as the two forces collided, it became very apparent that the Macedonians had a telling advantage over the enemy. The Europeans were fitted with body armor and heavy weapons, whereas their Persian foe was lightly clad in armor. And so, after stubborn resistance, the Persian horse slowly began to give one ground and were pushed backwards toward that of the center. So Alexander now gave the signal for the remaining Macedonian right wing cavalry, included in the elite companions, to cross the river and join the attack. And so charging out towards the extreme right of the two cavalry forces already engaged, the Macedonian horsemen easily outflanked the Persian left wing. And so the remaining Persian cavalry position along the river began to pull units back in the attempt to form a defensive line to halt the oncoming Macedonian cavalry. So Alexander Campbell, now again, we talked, I think, last week about him learning from that of Aristotle and others that taught that of logic. And that's what he does here. He's actually using logic to help him win the war. And so this maneuver opened a large gap in the Persian lines just right of the center. And since then, that alone, as we look at him, since the opportunity that Parmenian ordered the entire Greek army to lower their pikes and advance across the river in general advance. And Alexander's horsemen easily smashed through the thin Persian defensive line and were now bearing down on the Persian center. So this, along with the Greek infantry advancing on the whole front, created a complete panic amongst that of the Persian ranks, which quickly began to disintegrate and flee in all directions. In other words, they fled, they disbanded, as we would say. Or they probably would give a better word. But the Greek mercenaries watched in utter disbelief as the entire Persian army ran from for their lives, abandoned them to fight alone. And so we find that Alexander now ordered the Greek mercenaries to be surrounded. And although they asked the great king for mercy, Alexander would not listen. And so he felt personally betrayed by these fellow countrymen who had taken up arms against him. So he thus gave the order for their complete destruction. Some would complain about that, but again, as we said, they were mercenaries, and therefore they took up arms against the king. They were rebellion to that of the king of Greece. Therefore, this is what happened. The Greek Phalanxes answers on the mercenaries, head on down to the Macedonians. Cavalry attacked them from the rear, and after a savage and bitter defense, only 1,000 of the 8,000 mercenaries were spared and sent back as slaves to work in the silver mines of Greece. So the battle there at Granastus was now over. Persian losses were numbered 4,000 cavalry and 1,000 infantry. Alexander's casualties were non-existent, with losses of 200 cavalry and 100 infantry. And so Alexander's victory at Germanicus shattered the myth of the Persian invincibility and launched the persona of Alexander as one of the history's great commanders. We can understand it. When you go back to Daniel chapter 5, in verse 8, there's the verse we want. We give verses 8 and 10, but then we'll read all of those, and we're going to read them in that of the American Standard this time. It says, and the he goat magnified himself exceedingly, and when he was strong, the great horn was broken. And instead of it, there came up four notable horns toward the four winds of heaven. And out of one of them came forth a little horn, which waxed exceedingly great toward the south and toward the east and toward the glorious land. And it was waxed great even to the host of heaven. And some of the host of the stars it cast down to the ground and trampled upon them. So Greece, now the goat, grew very great as it extended its conquest farther into the territory formerly held by that of the Persians, the ram. So we have now the goat beating the ram. So the military might of Greece developed rapidly. Their history was one of conflict. They were tough people, especially the Spartans. The internal fighting among the Greek states had produced not only strong soldiers, but fine leaders, good equipment, and excellent tactics. And so they were outnumbered by the Persians, but they were able to subdue them. And that's because, again, of how that Alexander went about this. The great horn, with which the Grecian Empire overcame its enemies, was broken. Daniel, if we were to drop down to verse chapter 8 there, down to verse 21, I can get my compute here to compute. Okay, if you were to go down there, and I'm just going to read it, King James, and the rough goat is the king of Grecia, and the great horn that is between his eyes is the first king. So here it is that Daniel does not provide much details on how everything was shattered, but from that of history and from Daniel's plain statement, verse 21, we know that this great horn depicted Alexander the Great. So in his closing years, Alexander was exalted. Some say he exalted himself to divinity. And so this mighty general and conqueror suddenly died at the young age of 33 at the outer extent of his conquest. Now, back in Babylon, he abandoned himself more and more to drink. He drank more and more to drink. And so Alexander drained a goblet containing 6 quarts of wine. The next night, he drank heavily again. The cold weather suddenly set in. He called a fever and went to bed. And the fever raged, the cold weather, it raged for 10 days, during which Alexander continued to give orders to his army and his fleet. But on the 11th day, he died. He had 33 years of age. He died in 323 BC. With his generals asked him to whom he left his empire, he answered, to the strongest, according to Durant in the Life of Greece. That's a historian, set of books that you can get. The great horn was replaced by 4 lesser horns. You have to understand that there are 4 lesser horns. They're not as strong as the one horn. And so, which still remained the great power of, or they retained the great power of the Grecian Empire. However, these 4 generals divided the empire into 4 parts. If you keep a whole, you're stronger, but if you divide up in parts, you're not as strong. With each of them ruling a section, for many years there was no other world power that could challenge them. But the 4 generals who divided and ruled the territory conquered by Alexander was as follows. And there was one of them called Seleucus the first, and called also Dictator. The Greek word means conqueror. And we don't know when he was born, probably 358. There's a question mark there, to 281. So, it's 42. He lived a long life. That's the reason why we put a question mark there. King of Syria, 301 to 281. That would be 80. I have to do my math there. 20 years. I'm sorry. The founder, I heard something come up. Let me look at something else. I don't think anybody's trying to get in on it. Okay, the Alexander there, Seleucus, the founder of the Seleucid dynasty, he was a Macedonian general serving under Alexander the Great. And in the second partition of Alexander's empire, 321 BC, he was made a satrap, that's like of Babylon, a leader. becoming king of Babylon in 312 BC. So in 302 BC, he joined the Confederacy against Macedonia, and in 301, upon the death and a defeated death of King Antigonus I of Macedonia, obtained the largest share of the spoils, including the whole of Syria and a great part of Asia Minor. He built numerous cities, including Antioch, and several named for him as Seleucia. And so toward the end of his reign, he proclaimed himself to be king of Macedonia, but was subsequently assassinated. That's what happens when you, I guess, as we may say, that's what happens when you get too big for your britches, because he kept growing and growing and growing, and therefore he ended up being assassinated. That's one way of getting rid of some of those that you may fear. So then you have Cassander. He was ruled over Macedon and that of Greece, Macedonia and Greece, and Cassander about 358 to 297. So he was king of the Macedonia from 305 to 297 BC. And a son of Macedonia, General Antipater. But in 321 BC, after Alexander dies, we find that the king, the king being that Alexander was 336 to 323. So a couple of years later, Antipater was appointed supreme regent of Macedonia. Wait just a minute, something that I can change while we're talking here. So he was the, as we said, the regent of Macedonia. And upon his death in 319, which was 2 years, he handed the regency over to his colleague, that is Polyperchon. What a name. Even a subordinate position for his son, Cassandra. And Cassandra waged war against Polyperchon, successfully gaining control of Athens in 317 BC. He governed Athens for a decade through the statesman and orator Demetrius of Phaleron. In 316 BC, Cassandra persuaded Olympias, Alexander's mother, to return from Epirus to Macedonia, where he killed her. You don't want to be invited, I guess. That same year, Cassandra married Alexander's half-sister, Thessalonica. That later on, Thessalonica. Not long after, Cassandra slew Roxana, and Alexander's Persian wife, and their son, Alexander IV, thus ended Alexander's dynasty. And so here comes Lysimachus, controlled Thrace and Bithynia. And so 360 to 281 BC, he was king of Thrace, who was briefly killed, king of all of Macedonia in the 3rd century BC. And then you had Ptolemy ruled over Egypt, and we're going to call him Ptolemy I, the first, 367, 283, questionable on the dates. Ptolemy Soter, who was called Preserver, ruler of Egypt, 323 to 285, founder of the Ptolemaic dynasty, son of Lagus, a Macedonian of common birth. And so Ptolemy was a general in the army of Alexander the Great, and leading part in Alexander's later campaigns in Asia. And so on the death of Alexander in 323, his empire again was divided up among the successors. They had another name. It means successors by the emperor regent Perdiccas. And Ptolemy was appointed again a leader of Egypt and Libya. So he was from the first an independent ruler, engaged in long wars with other Macedonian chiefs in order to secure and extend his rule. So Ptolemy was prevented from holding Cyprus, Greece, but he resisted invasions of Egypt and Rhodes and occupied Palestine and Cyrenaica. So in 305 BC, he assumed the title of king. Now, Alexandra was his captain, and he founded the famous Alexandrian Library. And we can see, you can go back and read about that. It's an interesting thing in archaeology to read. He was the author of a host of history of the campaigns of Alexander. And in 285 BC, Ptolemy abdicated in favor of one of his younger sons. And so Daniel then tells us, now we want to go back to Daniel chapter 7. Daniel there tells us, Daniel 7 and in verse 8, Not too far. Daniel 7 and verse 8. There you go. We find that Daniel tells us that out of one of those four horns, one of the four sections into which the great empire had been divided, a little horn grew. Now he says there in reference to him, I considered the horns, and behold, there came up among them another little horn, before whom there were three of the first horns, and plucked by the roots. And behold, in this horn were eyes like the eyes of a man, and a mouth speaking great things. So this little horn arose much later during the time of the Roman Empire. Okay. So we're going to find out later about the little horn of our present text grew exceedingly great. So exerting its power and toward the south, toward the east, and toward the glorious land that is Canaan. Thus, this little horn, ensuing from one of the four great generals, would bring its harsh persecution upon the people of Israel, that is the people of God. Now, Leopold again says or tells us that when this horn first appeared, no one seemed to sense that it had an unusual future, but it grew exceedingly great, the Bible says. So already at this point, the figurative representation is to make to bear almost more than the figure allows, for the horn is said to go toward the south and toward the east and toward the glorious land. So it is difficult for us to visualize what the horn did, or how that the vision conveyed the idea of its growth in these three directions. Almost all the commentators refer this to as a reference to one of the Seleucids. There's another way of spelling that, and that's the way it's spelled there. So a king of Assyria, who in history had the name Antiochus Epiphanes. And we're going to read a lot about him when we get over to the Maccabean period. Who happened to be the 8th king of the dynasty. And there's a lot is said about him and what some of the things that he did. And he was a very terrible person. So a brief summary of the development that's given by Farah may serve to survive maybe some historical background. He says, but he was a man of ability, though with a taint of folly and madness in his veins. Taint. Taint, that is, by allied himself with Eumenes, king of Pergama, as we shall see hereafter. He suppressed Elidorus, secured the kingdom, and being very great, though only by fraud and cruelty and stratagem, assumed the title of Epiphanes the Illustrious. So he extended his power to the south by intriguing and warring against the Egypt, and his younger nephew, Ptolemy Mito. Now, we've already given all of these. We'll give all of these. I think we've already given them, but we'll give them. If we haven't, we will give them all of the Ptolemies of Egypt and the area. And so, and towards the sun rising by his success in the direction of Persia and Media, and towards the glory or ornament that is the Holy Land inflated with insolence, and he now sets himself against the stars. Now, that's what Pharaoh does. So the cruel ruler, identified as the little horn, became so self-exalted that he himself set himself up against the God of heaven. When he assaults God's people, he assaults God. And that's a lesson we can learn. Saul of Tarsus was charged with the crime of persecuting Christ because he was assailing followers of our Lord, Acts chapter 9. And so that's the idea. Now, Abraham's descendants were described as the stars of heaven, to note that great number. All the way back. There you is. Did you lose me? I lost me.
Yes.
I'm trying to get
For a
you
second,
back.
yes.
Yeah, I'm trying to get you back here. I can't. Well, there you go. Let me put you there. Then I'll move you back down here where I had you so I can see. Okay, I'm gonna just walk away because somebody's messing with the internet. Just hold on a minute.
Thank you.
Okay. It wasn't any of them, so it must just have been. It showed something up there. I guess it might have just been a glitch.
I see something about it says your bandwidth is getting low.
Well, it can't be because nobody's on the internet.
Thank you.
Wow, I got all lines there in reference to that. So
You got 4 bars on the bottom here.
yeah, I know it. That's what I got. So I don't know. We were talking about how that Paul there in reference, then we got to the descendants of that of Abraham. In Genesis 22, verse 15 to 18, the angel of the Lord said, I'll call upon Abraham out of heaven the second time and said, by myself have I sworn, saith the Lord, for because that thou hast done this thing and hast not withheld thy son, thy only son, that in blessing I will bless thee, and in multiplying I will multiply thy seed as the stars of the heaven and as the sand which is upon the seashore. And thy seed shall possess the gate of his enemies, and in thy seed shall all nations of the earth be blessed, because they have obeyed my voice. Here on 110, the Lord with your God have multiplied you, and behold, you are this day as the stars of the heaven for a multitude. So Daniel's reference there to that of the host of heaven. He talks about that of the host of heaven could easily be understood as the saints of God, the Israelites in Palestine during the rule of this evil ruler that we're going to talk about. And so they would be assaulted and they would be trampled underfoot. And like I said before, we're going to see in reference to that epiphanies, some of the things that Daniel had said. So that brings us to some broad features of the time were as follows. In other words, the return from Babylon was only partial at this time. A greater Palestine was being built up outside the Holy Land, and another greater another greater Palestine. Well, that's what it was now being built by Alexander. And so it was in that of the city of Alexandria. Now, Alexandria is, as I said before, a very important study in reference to itself. We're going to talk about it, but it would do you some good if you had an archaeology book to go over and just read all the things that they have found in Alexandria. But the city, as we think about it, Alexandria chose Rhocotis as the site of the metropolis of that of the Mediterranean world for the perpetuation of his fame and name. I said she, Alexandria, that is the city. And the engineers constructed such a harbor as the world had never seen before. Now, Alexander had settled many of the Jews in Alexandria because of their enduring qualities. And the colony of the Jews increased through continued immigration. In the course of time, the city of Alexandria was converted into what it was mostly a Jewish city. 2 out of the 5 quarters were wholly Jewish. So here the Jews, now watch this, they established the synagogues and the schools. All right, now we've seen the language being developed. And now we're seeing synagogues. Why synagogues? Because they're not all back in Jerusalem. They can't go to the temple. Therefore, they need a place to worship. And so they set up that of synagogues. And in synagogues and schools, they actually teach in their synagogues, as we would say, the Old Testament. And in their schools, they would teach their Jewish ways. And it's probably about like a school that we would have to do the very same thing. But Jerusalem was transplanted into Egyptian soil. So throughout Egypt and all along the coast of North Africa, similar communities were established. So an altar and temple to the Lord were built in Egypt to fulfill Isaiah 19:19, which Isaiah simply pointed out. It says, in that day shall there be an altar to the Lord in the midst of the land of Egypt, and a pillar at the border thereof to the Lord. Even Josephus, in his book, points this out too. Now, the influence of this movement led to the translation of the scriptures into the Greek, which is the Septuagint. So we found 3 things already during the time of Alexander. But again, notice that what's during that time between the Testaments, we are noticing that different things are taking place. So again, there's the Greek language. Now there's the synagogues and the schools for that be used by that of the Jewish people. And we would find that now they had taken the Hebrew Bible and they had translated it into the Greek. And so influence there. All over Asia Minor and Syria, the Jews had their colonies. Stop for a moment. If I were to turn over and read from Acts chapter 2, you would find where they had dispersed. That's the idea there. They have dispersed. They're everywhere. Now, if they're everywhere and the gospel is both for the Jews and the Gentiles, we find that people there that's going to be preaching and teaching the gospel are going to be able to go in and teach, hopefully, in that of the Jewish schools and that of their synagogues, and also in other places in reference to the Gentile people. So the influence of this movement led to that, of the translation of the scripture. Now, with the advent of Alexander the Great, Greek culture and Jewish revelation met. Both were potent forces, and Greece, for the first time, had become cognate of the Hebrews. The Greeks learned that the Hebrews possessed treasury of pottery and literal comparable literature comparable, in fact, more than comparable to their own. In other words, a whole lot better, they further learned that fidelity to a treaty has ever been an honorable tradition among the Jews. In other words, if you make a treaty with the Jews, they'll keep it. And Alexander was most favorably impressed with the Hebrews and declared that he would never permit Jerusalem, never, to be touched nor the temple polluted. So there was an influence of Greek ideas and custom and worship into Palestine. The Greek influence was very strong. Now, we know that if we were to go to Romans chapter 1 and also read the book of 1 Corinthians and also Galatians chapter 5 and other places, that we would find that influence among that of the Jewish people, but also among that of the Christian people, that is both Jews and Gentiles. Political conditions, Greek sympathies as the passport to favors, the fascination of Greek art and literature, these all united as a force to break through the crust of national Jerusalem. Now, again, when you study the culture and also archaeology of all these places, you get to see some of the pictures, some of the things they have found, and some of the pictures that people have made, and they've made them in color, and so they're very good to look at. You do that all the time. Grecianism poured into Palestine through many open channels. The liberalism of the day more and more sympathized with Greek culture and learning and with the Grecian way of life. Now, I think all of us, we know that when we study Old Testament, see the 10 Commandments and all the other commandments that are given, and also we see, the laws that God has given them to guide their life, and it's a good law of morality. But yet the Grecian law and the culture of the Grecians weren't that way. Because on the other hand, the conservatism of the day more and more absently resolved itself into a spirit of fanaticism, even to the point that it would fight against truth if it came under Greek guise. And so in these two antipodes, there's liberalism versus conservatism, were the progenitors of the Pharisees and Sadducees. So now you're seeing them develop. That is, we're seeing the Pharisees and the Sadducees develop during this time. So again, we're seeing these different sects that take place. Now stop for a moment. The Pharisees believed in the resurrection spirits and the Sadducees didn't. So that was stuff that was mixed in. The Sadducees had picked up some of that Greek culture. And so by the next generation or so, and the generation out of the Jewish people, there he goes again, says its connection is unstable. It goes again, the deliberate reference to them. We find that the next generation or so, two elements were drawn off to two hostile camps, mutually hating and both hateful. And so in reference to the Pharisees and the Sadducees, for the present, the conservatives called themselves Chassidim, or the godly party. So the liberals called themselves lovers of wisdom, or the sophists. Sophia. Sophia is the word for wisdom. So they were wisdom people, lovers of wisdom. And so then we find the next point is that the Egyptian period, that's just where we talk about the Ptolemies more. The Egyptian period is the next in order of world events. Particularly affected the Hebrews. And I have a note here that I have that this came, if you have a copy of the originals, I may have sent out a copy of the originals one time. This would be page 21, but it's page 78 on the ones that you have, Jim. For the first 100 years after the death of Alexander the Great, Palestine was held into the Ptolemies of Egypt. And a lot of times we hear a lot about the Ptolemies. It was 323 BC to 204. So that is actually, if we made that a 3, that would be a total of 80 years. So we're talking about 79 years. Now, let's see, did I do that right? 323 going down to 204. That'd be right. 96. Oh, that'd be more than that. It'd be 96 and 73. So it's 96. I didn't do that right, did I? It'd be 200 and not 209. No, you got to add. You got the 4 from 3 is 9. And then you have 1 there, and so it'd be 119 years. That's right. 119 of that's 323. Okay. So Palestine, though, was coveted by both the Syrians and the Egyptians. So General Ptolemy gained control of Egypt after Alexander's death. Now, Ptolemy assumed the title of king in 310 BC. And after he fought against the Seleucids, took control of Jerusalem by the sea, and carried many Jews captive to Egypt and settled them there. Now, that was contrary to what Alexander wanted. And if you recall, under his reign, no one was going to do that to Jerusalem. No one's going to mess with the temple. Josephus tells us that. Now, the order of the Ptolemies of Egypt was, Ptolemy I, he's called Sorter I, 323 to 285 BC. Ptolemy II, Philadelphus, 285 to 247 BC. Ptolemy III, the Variegated, 247 to 222 BC. Ptolemy V, Philopator, I got Philopator, 225 to 05 BC. Then Ptolemy V, Epiphanes, 205 182 BC. Then Ptolemy VI, Eupator, 182 181. He didn't last long. Then Ptolemy VII, that's Philometor, 181 to 146 BC. Then Ptolemy VIII, Philopator, notice they have similar names, 146 to 145. He didn't last long either. But Ptolemy IX, Physician, 145 BC. He didn't last long either. So now, when we look at these, like Ptolemy Philadelphus, I guess is the way you would say that. There, 285, 247 BC, he caused the Jewish law to be translated, and he also set free 120,000 natives of Jerusalem who were in slavery in Egypt. And so he was endeavoring to collect all the books that were in the world. So King, so we're going to call him just called Philadelphus. Philadelphus is his name, was also earnestly set upon collecting the book. So Demetrius Phalaris informed the king of the many of the books of laws among the Jews, but explained that the writings were in a character similar to that of the Assyrians. And so Eleazar, the high priest, cooperated with King Ptolemy. 6 men of good character, advanced in age, were chosen for each tribe. 12. 70 elders arrived, 12 tribes. The king, let me take it back. 6 men of each character, advanced in age, were chosen from each tribe. So 70 elders. The king treated them royally and dismissed all. He had other matters to commune with. I'm trying to think 6 men of good character. The different tribes there, because the tribes, 10 tribes have been carried off into captivity, so that would not be them. So 6 men of good character, and they were chosen from each tribe. So that would be 72. So the elders, so that's interesting, because we talk about the 10 tribes. And so, according to Eleazar, the high priest incorporated King Ptolemy. And we find that, they were chosen from each tribe. Each tribe, we would just simply think about Judah and Benjamin being there. That's another thing to look at. I try to look at that. The elders were greatly admired. Demetrius, the librarian, took them to the house near to the seashore, a quiet place. The elders were provided with all necessities, and the translation was completed in 72 days. Now, Demetrius gathered the Jews where the interpreters were, and the law was read. So the interpretation was to continue in its state. Every person was enjoined to point out anything superfluous. And so the king gave each interpreter 3 garments, 2 talents of gold, a cup of value, 1 talent, and the coats whereon he had fested. And so those men lived under their own laws and regulated their own affairs. That was, again, a point that would be helpful in reference to the spread of Christianity. Now, some general observations in relative to the Egyptian period of 100 years or more, such would include the following. The tendency continued to gather into the hands of the high priest as much of dignity and power as was permitted by the foreign rulers. In other words, they would, try to get all the power they possibly can. Now, the Ptolemies of Egypt were willing to recognize the high priest as their resident representative, as long as the annual tax tribute was paid to the Ptolemies. Interfered but little in the social affairs of that of the Jews. So the sacred office of high priest was thus grasped and degraded by the greedy, unscrupulous adventurers of that were there. And so the temple treasures were the spoils of their ambition and appearances. And so the highly priestly family became the most powerful and vile. And so that will bring us down to point number 5, which we're talking about the Syrian period. Think about it is next in order, in that of the world events particularly affected the Hebrews. So what we're doing is getting a picture of all these different nations around about, so that you can understand what's actually going on. That's the reason that, like we studied the book of Acts, and we get so far, we say, well, we need to stop and think about what went on with other books of the New Testament because they were being written. Well, we need to know what's going on with other nations also, as the New Testament's being written, what's going on in reference to the spread of the gospel. So here we have that, what's going on basically among that of the Hebrew people. So we'll take 15. Let me go here. All right, we resume. Okay, the Syrian period. We're going to go to Daniel chapter 11. Will be our looking here, because again, Daniel is prophesying about what's going to take place between the testaments. And I don't have it before me, but I will say this, Jim, that the book of Daniel is not in chronological order in which it was written. Maybe I can give that now. Let's see here. If I can find it. It's usually you read certain chapters. Chapters 2, 7, and 9 are the messianic chapters, where they have things involving Messiah. And I was I don't think I have written even in my Bible the order in which we usually read it, but I think somewhere along in there we put chapter 5. So that's 5 and 8 is one of the couple of chapters that we try to read in different chronological order. But here we find, when we get Daniel chapter 11 and go all the way back to verse 1, and I'm going to just go ahead and read 1 through 5. It says, also I, in the first year of Darius the Mede. See, now we're going back, okay? We've already come forward to Alexander the Great and so forth. Now we're going back a little. He says, also in the first year of Darius the Mede, even I stood to confirm and to strengthen him. And now when I show thee the truth, behold, there shall stand up yet 3 kings in Persia. For it shall be far richer than all. By his strength, though his riches, he shall stir up all against the realm of Greece. And a mighty king shall stand up and shall rule with great dominion and do according to his will. And when he shall stand up stand up, his kingdom shall be broken and shall be divided toward the four winds of hell, and not to his posterity, nor according to his dominion, which he ruled, for his kingdom shall be plucked up, and even for others beside those. And the king of the south shall be strong, and one of his princes, and he shall be strong above him and have dominion. His dominion shall be a great nation. And so basically, when you look here, the angel declares shall be a strong, and the king of the south, he says, of Daniel chapter 11 and verse 5. So the angel is speaking of the general history of that of Alexander. So let me get my computer to work. Speaking in reference to that of Alexander, there in Daniel chapter 11, the angel did speak in the general history of Alexander's empire, verses 1 through 4. The angel now leaves the general history and combines his prediction to the two parts of the kingdom, that is, the kingdom of the north and kingdom of the south. He's not talking about the Jewish people either. He's talking about of the kingdom there in reference to Alexander and Darius the Mede. So the two kingdoms are the north and south of Palestine, that is Syria and Egypt. And so the events of these kingdoms would particularly affect the Jewish people. Now, the king of the south, is Ptolemy, king of Egypt, and the Egyptian part of the empire was thus in the hands of the Ptolemies until Egypt was subdued by the Romans, and that would be later on. But the angel further goes, as I read verse 5, and one of his princes, and he shall be a strong above him. So one of his princes, that is one of the princes of Alexander would be strong above him, or mightier than the prince who would obtain that of Egypt. So this prince would have a more extended dominion, is the idea. And so the reference here is to Seleucus Nictor. In the division of the empire, he obtained Assyria, Babylon, and Media, and Susanna, and Armenia, and a part of Cappadocia and Cilicia. So his kingdom stretched forth from the Hellespont to the Indus. And so the Seleucus Nicator reigned from BC 312 to BC 280, or about 32 years, as we would say. So the angel still further declared down in verse 6, which I did not read. And in verse 6, he says, and in the end of the years, they that shall join themselves together, for the king's daughter of the south shall come to the king of the north to make an agreement, but she shall not retain the power of the arm, neither shall she stand, nor his arm, but she shall be given up, and they that brought her, and he that begot her, and he that strengthened her in these times. And so this angel is pointing out to us, in the end of the years, they shall join themselves together. In the end of the years means in the future period of history of the two kingdoms. So in other words, the events here referred to did not occur in the lives of these two kings, but rather many years later. So again, here's Daniel prophesying or telling us about some prophets that's going to take place. A statement that he makes there in verse 6, that they shall join themselves together, he says, means that an alliance would be formed or an attempt would be made to unite the two kingdoms. And so this unity would be affected by marriage, for the king's daughter of the south shall come to the king of the north to make an agreement. So there's going to be some type of agreement, a marriage type thing. And so the compact here referred to was the one formed by marriage between Bernice, I always say Bernice, daughter of Ptolemy, Philadelphus, king of Egypt, and Antiochus Theos, king of Syria. I changed his name to Philadelphia. That's not his name. But Ptolemy made this agreement in order to bring a close to a war with Syria in which he was engaged. One condition of this alliance was that Antiochus should divorce his former wife, Lacedonia. Lacedonia. Another condition was that the children of the former wife should be excluded from succession succession to the throne. And so Ptolemy hoped that the king of Syria might become ultimately attached to that, or Egypt. And so the angel then declared in verse 6 again, as we have, that she shall not retain the power of the arm. In other words, Bernice would not hold her power. Her father, Ptolemy, Philadelphus, Philadelphus, again, is that it was put in there, died 2 years after and of this, and this marriage that it was consummated. And so Antiochus then restored again to his former wife, Laodicea. You mispronounce those words. Let's see it. And so that's the way that they actually did some things during that time. And so they would marry and then remarry and so forth. So that was Ptolemy. But officers of the court of Syria planned the death of Bernice and her children, but she fled with them to Daphne and was there. She was put to death. So the angel declared, neither shall he stand, meaning that the king of the south, Ptolemy Philadelphus, shall not prosper in this ambitious purpose to bring Syria by the marriage of alliance under his control. And so the angel's statement then goes on and says, but she, I think I want to sneeze, she shall be given up, means that she, Bernice, should be given up to death. A statement that he that begot her seems to say that her child or her offspring would be put to death. So the angel's statement that he that strengthened her in these times probably refers to some now unknown confidential counselor. Look at verse 7 of Daniel 11. It says there, but out of the branch of her roots shall one stand up in his estate, which shall come with an army and shall enter into the fortress of the king of the north and shall deal against them and shall prevail. So the angel here just simply points this out. This means that one of her family would spring up to avenge her. And so out of Bernice's roots, so to speak, her brother Ptolemy Euergetes, if I was young and don't have children, I'd have to name them some of these names so I could pronounce them. But Euergetes hastened with a great force out of Egypt to rescue and defend her, but in vain. And so the angel stated that the branch of her roots shall with his army enter the fortress of the king of the north and shall deal against them and shall prevail. With Ptolemy there, let me spell that, Ptolemy, Euergetes fails to rescue her sister. So he, in conjunction with an army that came from Asia Minor for that purpose, set out to avenge his sister's death. So here is Ptolemy Euergetes makes himself master not only of Assyria and Cilicia, but also passed over the Euphrates River, brought all under subjection to him as far as the river Tigris. So the angel furthered declared that the branch, Ptolemy Euergetes, or as he is called, the benefactor, shall also carry captive into Egypt their gods with their princes and with their precious vessels of silver and of gold, and he shall continue more years that the king of the north. So Jerome states that Ptolemy, Jerome is a historian, states that Ptolemy took with him on his return to Egypt 40,000 talents of silver, a vast number of precious vessels of gold, 2,400 images, among which were many of the Egyptian idols. Many of the idols were those which Cambyses took into Persia when he failed to conquer Egypt. And so Ptolemy restored these idols to the temple, and by this much endeared himself to the people. And you can imagine that would exactly take place. On account of this service which he rendered to his country, he was called Ergetis, that is the benefactor. So he survived Seleucus for about got you back.
I see about it. You were there, then you just disappeared.
I know it. I set my drink down and it jarred the table or something or other. So I don't might have a loose wire. I have to check that. Anyway, Ptolemy Euergetes survived Seleucus for about 4 years, and then the reading in Daniel chapter 11 and verse 9. So the king of the south shall come into his kingdom and shall return into his own land. And so this has reference to that of the sons or the king of the north or of Syria. Seleucus Callinicus was killed by a fall from his horse, and his two sons, Seleucus Cyrenius and Antiochus the Great, continued the war until the death of that of the former, and then it was continued along by Antiochus. And Seleucus Cyrenius, Thunder, they called him, succeeded his father, but he died soon after. So Antiochus the Great, now Antiochus the Great, succeeded to the kingdom when he was only 15 years of age. And so again, we see that happening, and it happens a lot. But so most of them have someone that is also assigned to them to help them in reference to taking care of that of the kingdom of which they are king. And we understand that. I'm flickering, so I don't know what's taking more. So the angel said of the two sons and the king of Syria, and shall, in verse 10 there it says, but his son shall be stirred up and shall assemble a multitude of great forces, and one shall certainly come and overflow and pass through. Then shall he return and be stirred up even to his fortress. So only one of the sons, Antiochus the Great, actually prosecuted the war. He passed through the land, not the land of Egypt, but every part of Syria. And so the statement there in chapter 11 and verse 10, then shall he return and stir up. So this was literally true because Ptolemy marched into Syria with an army of 75,000 footmen, 5,000 horses, and 73 elephants. Antiochus met him with 62,000 footmen, 6,000 horses, and 102 elephants. So Antiochus was defeated and he returned to Antioch. So the following year, Antiochus rallied his forces. Syria took Gaza and subdued the whole country of Syria, including that of Palestine. So here's this conquering thing again that Daniel is telling. So the angel declared this in verse 11. He says, the king of the south shall be moved with choler, that anger, and shall come forth and fight with him, even the king, he says, of the north. Daniel 11:11. So this reference here is to Ptolemy, Philopator, Ptolemy, who succeeded Ptolemy Euergetes in Egypt. Now, Philopator was exasperated at the conduct of Antiochus the Great. And so he assembled an army, marched to Raphia, where he found a battle with Antiochus. Not a battle. And so the angel continued, he says, he, Ptolemy, shall set forth a great multitude, that is an army. The multitude of Antiochus's army shall be given into his, Ptolemy's hand. So the multitudes may also refer to the fact that the inhabitants of Illyrica and Palestine would hasten to submit themselves to Ptolemy. And so they long had been under the government of Egypt and preferred that to the government of Antioch. And so Ptolemy's Philopator's heart, according to the angel, would be lifted up. Notice verse 12. Yeah, verse 12. And when he had taken away the multitude, his heart shall be lifted up, and he shall cast down many 10,000 thousands, but he shall not be strengthened by it. So he would glory in the many 10,000s that he would cast down, but he was not strengthened by it because he gave himself up to the employment of that of pleasure and actually weakened himself with his own people. So his people, who expected much more out of him, became dissatisfied, and with his conduct, and they broke out in rebellion. So Daniel will go on to say in verse 13, for the king of the north shall return and shall set forth a multitude greater than the former, and shall certainly come after certain years with a great army and with many riches. So the angel declares was the king there. So this is 14 years later. Antiochus the Great came again in the regions of Syria and Palestine to recover the territory. So he came with a greater multitude, that is a greater army. In other words, he brought with him forces with which he had successfully invaded the east. Now watch him in verse 14. It says, and in those times there shall many stand up against the king of the south. Also the robbers of thy people shall exalt themselves to establish a vision for they shall fall. So we find that this would be especially Philip, king of Macedon, and Agathocles, well, yeah, I said the best I could, who excited a rebellion against him. So the angel now, according to verse 14, here turns to Daniel and states that what would be done in these circumstances by his own people, the robbers of thy people shall exalt themselves, the angel said. So in other words, a portion of the Jews would take occasion from the weakness of the youthful monarch of Egypt and the conspiracies in his own kingdom and the foreign combinations against him to attempt to throw off his authority. So these were called the robbers, or the sons of the pest of the people. Josephus actually records that the Jews went over to Antiochus the Great in book 12, chapter 3, section 3. So the Jews carrying out the terms of the invasion would fail. And so the angel said they would not accomplish the objects that they had in view. So the king of the north, according to the angel, now watch him in verses 15 and 16. So the king of the north shall come and cast up a mount and take the most fenced city, and the arms of the south shall not withstand neither his chosen people, neither shall there be any strength to withstand. Then verse 16, but he that cometh against him shall do according to his own will, and none shall stand before him, and he shall stand in the glorious land which by his hand shall be consumed. And so the glorious land there is Palestine, and the arms of the south were unable to withstand Antiochus the Great. So he was entirely successful in establishing his own rule. And so of that of Syria and that of Palestine. Josephus tells us that the land of the Jews were sorely harassed with Antiochus the Great because he was at war with Ptolemy Philopater, and Antiochus the Great then set his race to bring all Egypt into subjection. And when you look at verse 17 of Daniel chapter 11. He shall also set his face to enter with the strength of his whole kingdom, and upright ones with him. Thus shall he do, and he shall give him the daughter of women, corrupting her, but she shall not stand on his side, neither be for him. So he became involved in that of war with that of the Romans, and was thus hindered. And so this emergency, and to veil the possibility of Egypt joining with the Romans, he gave his daughter Cleopatra, daughter of women, verse 17, in marriage with an Egyptian prince to accomplish the ends which he had in view. So now Antiochus the Great negotiated a marriage between his daughter Cleopatra and Ptolemy Epiphanes. And so this contract was that the marriage should take place as soon as the parties were of suitable age. So Syria and Palestine were to be given as Cleopatra's dowry or consideration. So Ptolemy Epiphanes was 13 at the time the contract was made. The contract was made in 197 BC, and the marriage was consummated 193. So I made him 17 years old. So now Antiochus the Great instilled his daughter's mind evil principles in order that she may betray her 17-year-old husband. and thus by the aid of her arts he might obtain possession of Egypt. So the angel had stated in verse 17 that she shall not stand on his side, that is on her father's side, but rather on her husband's side. So after this, Antiochus the Great turned his face and took many of the isles, that is, the isles of the Mediterranean, constituted a part of Greece. Look at verse 18. After this shall he turn his face unto the isles, and shall take many. But a prince for his own behalf shall cause the reproach offered him to cease. Without his own reproach shall cause it to turn upon him. So this he did in his war with that of the Romans. He supposed that by the marriage of his daughter to the Egyptian prince, that he had guarded himself with an army interference from that of the Egyptian. And so the angel further declares that a prince of his own behalf shall cause the reproach offered by him. Now the reference here is to Lucius Cornelius Scipio as Asiaticus. We'll call him Lucius. How about that? In war, Antiochus the Great, he succeeded in retrieving the honor of the Roman name. So the disgrace that Antiochus the Great reaped upon the Romans was now turned upon him. And so we would find that Antiochus the Great experienced successive defeats, and he experienced a final and complete overthrow. What happened? Overthrow in the Battle of Magnesia around BC, as we would say, BC 190. And he experienced successive defeats, and he experienced a final complete overthrow there, as we said, in 190 by Scipio. Antiochus lost all the presence of mind and withdrew his garrison from all the cities on the Hellespont, and in his precipitated flight left all of his military stores behind. So Alexander the Great, Antiochus the Great, in time sued for peace. And the terms were this: number one, that he would surrender all his possessions west of Taurus. Number two, that he would defray the expense of the war. And number three, he would keep no elephants. And so number four, he would keep no more than 12 ships. So basically, to secure the performance of the peace terms, the Romans required Antiochus the Great to deliver 12 hostages, including his own son, Antiochus Epiphanes. This stay of Antiochus Epiphanes in Rome would later have considerable bearing on the Jews. Okay? This moves the broad area of history to the terror of that Antiochus Epiphanes, the madman, according to the Jews. And we'll see that. Caused Epiphanes, he persecuted the Jews in keeping with Daniel's prophecy. Now let's go to Daniel's prophecy in Daniel chapter 11, and we're going to begin in verse 21 down to verse 45. Okay, a long reading, but it helps us to see what's going on. He says, and in his estate shall stand up a vile person, to whom they shall not give the honor of the kingdom, but he shall come in peaceably and obtain the kingdom by flatteries. And with the arms of a flood shall be overthrown, they shall be overthrown from before him, and shall be broken, yea, also the prince of the covenant. And after the league made with him, he shall work deceitfully, for he shall come up and shall become strong with a small people. He shall enter peaceably even upon the fattiest places of the province. He shall do that which is his fathers had not done, nor his fathers' fathers. He shall scatter among them the prey, and spoil and riches. Yea, and he shall forecast his devices against the strongholds, even for a time. And he goes on, and he shall stir up his power and his courage against the king of the south with a great army, and the king of the south shall be stirred up to the battle with a great, very great and mighty army, but he shall not stand, for they shall forecast devices against him. Yea, they that fed of the portion of his meat shall destroy him, and his army shall overflow, and many shall fall down slain. And both these kings' hearts shall be to do mischief, and they shall speak lies at one table, but it shall not prosper, for yet the end shall be at the time appointed. And notice that time appointed. Then shall he return in his land with great riches, and his heart shall be against the holy covenant, and he shall do exploits and return to his own land. And at the time appointed he shall return and come toward the south, but it shall not be as the former or as the latter. The ships of Chittim shall come against him, therefore he shall be grieved and return and have indignation against the holy covenant. So he shall do. He shall even return and have intelligence with them that forsake the holy covenant. And arms shall stand on his part, and they shall pollute the sanctuary of strength, and shall take away the daily sacrifice, and they shall place the abomination that maketh desolate, and shall do wickedly against the covenant, shall be corrupt by flatteries, but the people that do know their God shall be strong and do exploits. And they that understand among the people shall instruct many, yet they shall fall by the sword and by flame, by captivity, by spoil, many days. Now, when they shall fall, they shall be hoping with a little help, and shall, but many shall cleave with their flatteries, and some of them of their understanding shall fall, to try them, to purge, and to make them white, even to the time of the end, because it is yet for a time appointed. Notice that again. And the king shall do according to his will, and shall exalt himself and magnify himself above every god, and shall speak marvelous things against the God of gods, and shall prosper till the indignation be accomplished, for that is determined shall be done. For that is the determined shall be done. Neither shall he regard the God of his fathers, nor the desire of women, nor regard any God, for he shall magnify himself above all. But in his estate shall he honor the God of forces, and a God whom his fathers knew not shall he honor with gold and silver and precious stone and pleasant things. Then shall he do it in the midst of the strongholds with a strange God, who he shall acknowledge and increase with glory, and shall cause them to rule over, and shall divide the land for gain. And at that time, and at the time of the end, shall the king of the south push at him, and the king of the north shall come against him like a whirlwind, with chariots, with horsemen, with many ships, and shall enter into the countries, and shall overflow and pass over. Shall enter in also into the glorious land, and many countries shall be overthrown, but these shall escape out of his hand, even Edom, Moab, and the chief children of Ammon. He shall stretch forth his hand also upon the countries, and the land of Egypt shall not escape, but he shall have power over the treasures of gold and silver, and over all the precious things of Egypt, and the Libyans and the Ethiopians shall be at his steps. The tidings out of the east and out of the north shall trouble him. Therefore he shall go forth with great fury to destroy, in order to make away many. And he shall plant the tabernacles of his place, or his palace, between the seas in the glorious holy mountain. Yet he shall come to his end, and none shall help him. In other words, there's going to come a time when he's going to need help, and there will be no help for him. So when you look at this in the chapter, verse 20 there, he refers to Seleucus Philopater, the eldest son of Antiochus the Great, who succeeded to the kingdom on the death of his father, and he reigned 11 years, during which time he heavily taxed the people. And nobody likes taxes. Okay? So he sent Heliodorus to Jerusalem to plunder the city in the guise of taxing them. So he was later poisoned by Heliodorus, who sought to raise him to the position of king. And so Epiphanes, then in Athens, on his return from Rome, and applied to Eumenes, king of Pergamus, and to his brother Taulus, and made deprive Heliodorus of his authority. So Epiphanes IV ruled Syria from 175 BC to 163 BC. And now notice we're getting closer and closer in reference to the Roman Empire. This Antiochus IV bore the surname Epiphanes, the illustrious. And so the Jews, master of the innuendo, gave him the nickname the Madman. And that again should be PH there. I don't know if that's yours, Epiphanes. It should be the Madman. So he was born in Athens and served as chief magistrate for the city whose very culture was the epithet I lost my place. Or everything Greek. He had spent 12 years as a hostage in Rome, where he learned to respect the new power, which was to conquer the world. With a sense of mission, he determined to civilize, that is, Hellenize the domain and over which he would rule. And many of the Jews advocate a greater conformity to the Hellenistic manners and custom that simply meant that they were given over to that of the customs and so forth. Many of the Jews had capitulated to the Hellenistic way of life. In the early days of Antiochus IV, Jerusalem was ruled by the high priest Onus III, a descendant of Simon the Just and a strict Orthodox Jew. The Jews looked favorably on Greek culture opposed Onias. Okay, now here again is you have two cultures that are trying to come together, which we will see also in reference to problems with the Jews and Gentiles. But espoused to the cause of his brother. So Antiochus IV, the high priesthood, was a political office, but to the pious Jews, it was of divine origin. So that caused the problem. So when Jason promised a larger tribute to Antiochus, then Onias III was paying, and Antiochus appointed him high priest in the place of Onias III. And so Jason encouraged the Hellenistics who had sought his election. A gymnasium was built in Jerusalem. The Jews played games in the nude along with the Gentiles. Stop for a moment and think that. What did their laws teach them back in the Old Testament times? When Moses gave the laws to them in Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy. So they're playing games in the nude with the Gentiles. Josephus states this. He says the sons of Tobias took the part of the Menelaus, but the greater part of the people assisted Jason, and by that means Menelaus and the sons of Tobias were distressed and retired to Antiochus and informed him that they were desirous to leave the laws of their country and the Jewish way of living according to them and to follow the king's laws and the Grecian way or living. Wherefore they desired his permission to build a gymnasium at Jerusalem. And so when he had given them leave, they also hid the circumcision of their genitals. And even when they were naked, they might appear to be Greeks. A footnote at the above reference also reads that this word gymnasium properly denotes a place where the exercises were performed naked, which because it would naturally distinguish circumcised Jews from uncircumcised Gentiles, these Jewish apostates endeavored to appear uncircumcised by means of a operation, chirurgical operation. You need to add by this St. Paul in First Corinthians chapter 7, verses 18, and described by Celius also, as Dr. Hudson informs us. Okay. Now later, the Hasidim party was really infuriated when Antiochus IV appointed Menelaus, a Benjamite, as high priest. He was not supposed to be a high priest. He's a Benjamite. So while the developing tide of Hellenism, there developed resistant movement, the Hasidim, the pious party, which attempted a defense of the Orthodox Jewish institutions. So in keeping with Daniel's prophecy in verses 21 to 27 of chapter 11, concerning Antiochus Epiphanes IV, this Antiochus made war against Egypt, verse 25. So in the course of his reign, he four times invaded Egypt with various degrees of success. Now his third invasion of Egypt was on a pretense of supporting Ptolemy Philometor against the usurpation of his brother Ptolemy Physcon, who the Egyptians had raised to the throne. Now again in verse 27, it says, and both of these kings' hearts shall be to do mischief. That is, both were set on some evil, some unjust purpose of deceit. That's the way they worked among their families. Antiochus IV invaded the country under pretense of aiding Ptolemy and established him in the government. And for the same reason, under pretense of protecting him, he had Ptolemy in his possession. Well, Ptolemy, though a captive, was treated as a king as a matter of policy. Ptolemy, while dining with Antiochus IV, entered into the engagements and agreements which he did not intend to keep, according to verse 27. In verse 28, Antiochus IV then returned to his own land with great riches. But Antiochus Epiphanes IV, on his return from Egypt, caused to bring desolation in Jerusalem. His heart was against the Holy Scripture. Now, going back to verse 28 there, this is one of the things I said we have to watch, and we're going to talk more about him because when we get in the Maccabean period and everything, things are going to come up in reference. He says there in verse 28, and shall he return, we're talking about Antiochus Epiphanes IV, when he shall return into his land with great riches, and his heart shall be against the holy covenant. That is, it's going to be against the scriptures. And so Menelaus welcomed him to Jerusalem. He placed what was left of the temple treasure at Antiochus' disposal. They destroyed the temple. So Menelaus was now very unpopular with many of the Jews, and he found it more necessary to court the favor of Antiochus. Epiphanes IV made another campaign down in verse 29 there to that of Egypt, and he came very close to completely subduing the empire of the Ptolemies. So he was deterred from that of the coveted victory by the Romans. So Rome was not ready to annex Syria and Egypt, but Rome nevertheless was not willing to permit Antiochus IV to strengthen himself by annexing Egypt. So Antiochus IV had long ago learned to respect Rome. And so in a famous scene outside the city of Alexandria, remember Alexandria had a lot of Jews in it, the Roman envoy demanded that Antiochus IV, before he stirred from a circle drawn around him on the ground, promised to evacuate Egypt. So with these dreams of grandeur suddenly dissipated, Antiochus Epiphanes IV sorely grieved at his heart, verse 30 says. And so we find that he turned back into that of bitterness. And so he had an indignation, verse 30 says, against the Holy Covenant. So in his marching back through Palestine, he detached from his army 22,000 men under the control of Apollonius, and sent them to Jerusalem to destroy, according to Josephus. So pretended peace, he got possessions of the opponents of the high priest, Menelaus, and a Sabbath attack. You know what the Jews would be doing. The Sabbath attack, he slew large numbers. He plundered the temple and he left it bare. He forbade the Jews to offer daily sacrifices. He pillaged the whole city. The city wall was, should be there, destroyed. And more than 10,000 men, women, and children were taken captive. Now, the finest buildings were turned. A citadel was built in the lower part of the city, and fortified with high walls were dwelt impious and the wicked part of the Jewish multitude. And an idol altar was built on God's altar, upon God's altar. Antiochus IV sacrificed a sow, pig, upon the altar. He compelled the Jews to cease and to forsake worship to their God, is to Jehovah. He required the Jews to build temples and to raise idol altars in every city and to worship by offering swine upon them every day. He prohibited the Jews from circumcising their sons, and he caused to be strangled the sons who were circumcised and their mothers who caused them to be circumcised. Books of the law, which they found, they tore to pieces and burned with fire. 1 Maccabees 1:56. Anyone found with the book of the covenant. Let me go something right quick. I'm gonna do something if I can. Where'd you go? I'm going to read that first Maccabees, from my King James Bible on my program here that has it in there. I did not mark this. That's the reason why I don't have it already. I wanted to mark them and write down. It says here in the Maccabees, First Maccabees 1:56, and when they had rent in pieces the books of the law, which they found, they burned them with fire. So they literally done that. Anyone found with the book of the covenant in his possession was condemned to death. Doesn't that sound about like something that happened after the first century? Reference to the scriptures. So an elderly Athenian philosopher was sent to Jerusalem to supervise the enforcement of the order. So he identified the God of Israel with Jupiter. That comes up too, does it not? And ordered a bearded image of the pagan deity, perhaps the likeness of Antiochus Epiphanes IV, set upon the temple altar. Now, Daniel says, back to Daniel, chapter 11 and verse 31. Now, I want you to notice this because of what comes up later. And arms shall stand on his part, and they shall pollute the sanctuary of strength, and shall take away the daily sacrifice, and they shall place the abomination that maketh desolation. Daniel 11:31. Greek soldiers and their paramours performed licentious heathen rites in the very temple court. The drunken orgy assisted with the worship of Bacchus was made compulsory. Truly, Antiochus Epiphanes IV was a vile person. Daniel said he was in Daniel 11, verse 21, the madman of the Jewish description. He boasted that the religion of Jehovah had ceased to be. So that brings us now to the Maccabean period. That's page 89. The Maccabean period, in my notes, Maccabean period is the next in order in the world events that particularly affected the Hebrews. Now, I'm going to have to find, we go through here, the Maccabeans, because I do not have them marked, okay? So we'll take a pause and I'll go over because I'm going to read them. So we'll notice that we're reading directly from the Maccabean. I've got chapter 1 and chapter 2 here before me. So Mattathias, that is Maccabeus Mattathias, led a revolt against the cruelties and persecutions of Antiochus Epiphanes IV. Now, Maccabeus Mattathias was a modest, God-fearing man. He was a priest. He came to be known by the title Maccabeus. The origin of the title is unknown. We don't know. He lived in a small town called Modin, M-O-D-I-N, 5 miles from Jerusalem. Certain officers of Antiochus came transversing the country, enforcing an edict for all the Jews to sacrifice to the gods. The officers called upon Mattathias as a man of influence to set an example of obedience for the others to follow. Mattathias was ready for death, but not for apostasy. So a degenerate time saver stepped forward, anxious for favor, to show the way to the faithfulness of the gods. And so with a blow, Mattathias laid the apostate dead. All right. First Maccabeans. Did you get a one?
I'm trying to find it. I have one. I'm trying to find it on my tablet.
Oh, okay. I'll read this one. Are they on your notes or are these later notes?
Yeah, they're on these notes.
Okay. In First Maccabees 2:24, it says, which thing when Mattathias saw, he was inflamed with zeal, and his reins trembled. Neither could he forbear to show his anger according to judgment. Wherefore he ran and slew him upon the altar. So the die was cast. Mattathias' 5 sons gathered round. The villagers responded. The guards were put to flight. War for country and creed had begun. Maccabeus Mattathias had 5 sons. The name of their sons was John, surnamed Gadai, called the Holy. Simon, surnamed Besai, called the Guide. Judas, surnamed Maccabeus, called the Hammer. Eleazar, surnamed Avarin, called the Beast Sticker. Jonathan, I think that's what they say. I think they would go Nathan or something like that, but we say Jonathan, surnamed Alphas, called the Cunning. Now, these sons were loyal to each other. They were free from unselfish ambition, like everything we see during the times of the kings, back in First and Second Kings, First and Second Chronicles, even also in some Samuel. They were single in devotion to a cause. Each came to the front of it in his own time, one by one. They all came to the front, not in order of age. Maccabeus, Mattathias, soon succumbed to old age and hardship. So within only a few months, Mattathias sank under the years and hardships. He recommended on his dying bed that Judas, now you go back and look, Judas is the third, assumed supreme command. Judas was equal to the confidence imposed in him by his father. But we find as we think about him, Judas, called the Hammer, Judas the Hammer assumed control. Now, Judas's father had described him as mighty and strong from his youth up. Down in First Maccabees, chapter 3 and verse 4, and I said we're going to roll down there. Verse 4, he says there, here it's in the notes there, but not the full, the whole thing's there. He was in his acts like a lion, and like a lion's whelp, roaring for his prey. First Maccabees 3 and verse 4. Then drop down to verse 9, and there it says, so that he was renowned unto the utmost part of the earth, and he received unto him such as were ready to perish. From the fugitives of the hills, he formed a infantry whose steady discipline and inspired by the religious rested and broke at odds of 10-1 the troops of a mighty king. So the first state of his career consisted of the following. Apollonius, Syrian governor of Samaria, gathered Gentiles, a large force from Samaria to fight against Israel. Judas, and I want to say the Hammer now, Judas the Hammer swept down upon them. He routed Apollonius' army, slew him, won his sword, and fought with it for his lifetime. Sihon, a commander of the Syrian army, advanced to avenge the death of the Syrians and also to make a name of himself. Judas' army sank beneath the great array. Judas replied to him, it is no hard matter for many to be shut up in the hands of a few, and with the God of heaven, it is all one to deliver with a great multitude or with a small company. They came against us to destroy us and our wives and our children, but we fight for our lives and our gods. Now remember, God is not speaking during this time. God is not giving revelation. Now what God is doing through providence has already been planned out in a plan, okay, that is developed and will be developed in reference to the coming of the church. So the place for battle was the old historical battleground, the pass of Beth Horon. Joshua had broken the confederacy of the Amorite kings. So the irregular infantry of Israel routed the cavalry squadrons and the professional soldiers. Then you had a lot, Lysias, the governor of Syria. Now that you had the general, now you had the other fellow, now you have the governor of Syria. In the absence of Antiochus, who was on an expedition to Egypt from where he never returned to attack. He had an army of 40,000 footmen and 7,000 horses, and they were only 6,000 in Judas's army. Judas sifted his army of all who were afraid to die. His number divided into only 3,000. Be ready against the morning, Judas admonished. He says, for it is better for us to die in battle than to see the evils of our nations and holies. Next day, they proved that they fight best, pray most. Lysias had detached a choice group of corps to surprise the Jewish camp. I'm gonna look like there's something there, and it was, and there, and it was. There's a period in front of Judas and the Jews. And so, but Judas had learned this, and so he broke into camp of the regular army. The route was complete. The choice corps arrived and found a deserted camp. So wearied, the choice corps returned to join the rest of the army. Judas's army army attacked their choice corps in plain and routed them. So we find that Lysias returned to the following year. And so he led in person this time 60,000 footmen, 5,000 horsemen. And I think that horseman is supposed to be one word for some reason. But Judas met them at Beth Zur. That's near Jerusalem with 10,000 footmen. Judas lost 5,000 men, but he gained the victory. Judas then entered upon the second stage of his career, the work of his crowning career, the recovery of the capital and the purification of the temple. So Judas was now master of most of Judea. He then turned to cleanse the sanctuary and to dedicate it in keeping with the prophecy of Daniel chapter 12. So now let's go back to Daniel chapter 12 because we would need to know the prophecy. And we may just read it and comments. I have to get there because I wasn't there. Okay. All right. He begins the latter part. This is last words from Daniel. And he said, "Go thy way, Daniel, for the words are closed up and sealed to the time of the end. Many shall be purified and made white and tried, but the wicked shall do wickedly, and none of the wicked shall understand, but the wise shall understand. And from the time that the daily sacrifices shall be taken away, and the abomination that maketh desolation set up, there shall be 1,290 days. Blessed is he that waiteth and cometh to the 1,330 days. But go thou thy way till the end be, for thou shalt rest and stand in that thy lot at the end of these days." Excuse me. So they built a new altar. They built the sanctuary. And we find also that they dedicated it in keeping of the prophecies, which is going to do that of Daniel. But then we find that it's consecrated, all of that type of thing that is being done. But all the way back over to first Maccabees, back to Maccabees chapter 4. I'll give you time there to get there. Let me know if when you get there. 42. Okay. 42 down to 51.
Got it.
Okay. He begins there. He says, so he chose, that's mine. So he chose priests of blameless conversation, such as had pleasure in the law, who cleansed the sanctuary and bear out the defiled stones into an unclean place. And when, as they consulted what to do with the altar of burnt offerings, which was profane, they thought it best to pull it down, lest it should be reproached to them, because heathen had defiled it. Wherefore they pulled it down, laid up on the stones in the mountain of the temple in a convenient place, until there should come a prophet to show what should be done with them. Then they took whole stones according to the law and built a new altar according to the former, and made up the sanctuary, the things that were within the temple, and hallowed the courts. They made also new holy vessels, and into the temple they brought the candlestick and the altar, burnt offerings and the incense into the table. And upon the altar they burned incense, and the lamps that were upon the candlesticks they lighted, that they may give light in the temple. Furthermore, they set the loaves upon the table, and spread out the veils, and finished all the works that they had begun to make. So they determined to do this. So they determined also that every year at that season of the day of dedication, the altar should be observed. Now, in First Maccabees chapter 4 and verse 9, and this is in the notes, it says, then Judas and his brothers and all the assembly of Israel determined that every year at that season, the days of the dedication of the altar should be observed with gladness, joy for 8 days, beginning with the 25th day of the month of Chislev. Maccabees chapter 4 and verse 59. Now, over in John chapter 10 and verse 22, and I'm not going to turn over there, Jesus attended the Feast of Dedication, okay? So though Judas was a master of the Judea, there was, as I already said, made reference to that, there was a large population of Jews in Galilee. But these, you got a 38 there,
Yes.
the old page number. But these were cut off by the Samaritans, who were strong in number, wealth, and influence. Bobby, got in there. Have to take it. Forward to something. Influence. Okay. With the Assyrian garrisons, they too were implacable in their hostility toward that of the Jews and also to that of Jerusalem. What am I doing? Still can't get. There you go. And so on the east, across the Jordan, the news was also numerous, but they were surrounded by the warlike Moabites, Ammonites, and Arabians. Okay, and so in the south, the Edomites or Idumeans disposed of their mountains by the Arabs and pressed upon almost to get to the gates of Jerusalem itself. Now, on the southwest, the old enemies, the Philistines, were still in force. So to add this, the Syrian garrison still held the Sentinel or the holy city, and Judas did not have the artillery necessary for its reduction. So further, the Hellenistic Jews were bitter enemies of Judas. They had apostatized during the persecutions and favored compromise. They looked upon the Chasdean party as being fanatical firebreeds who would ruin the nation. And so these Hellenistic sapped the courage and faith of that of Judas's followers. And so we find that tales of massacre in the north and south, and either each poured upon Judas was appeals for assistance. And Judas, as the hammer, prepared mighty blows. He rushed upon the Idumeans and crushed them. He divided his force and sent his elder brother Simon to the north, while he swept the east. Simon thus succeeded, relieving Galilee, routing the forces of the Greeks, the cities victorious, Greek cities victory. Why that's capital had a victory there. And we find Judas was also successful with 5,000 men. He dashed against one of the besieging forces after another and scattered them. For a whole year, he continued his victorious force. He stormed Hebron, the old tribal capital, or Judah held by the Idumeans, and wiped it out. Next, he went westward and conquered the Philistines and captured the ancient city of Ashdod. And in 2 years, we find that Judas had returned to Judah, having conquered the enemies round about. Okay, and we have to stop there because our time is past time. We don't want to go over. Jim will go to sleep. Bobby will too. You got any questions? Let me see here. We want to